Some truths are not buried in darkness, but veiled beneath the silken folds of loyalty and fear. It begins with the arrival of a foreign visitor in London's drawing rooms, and with whispers of stolen letters that conceal something far more perilous than sentiment. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. Now, let us follow Holmes into the shadows of Mayfair, where every gesture, every silence, carries the weight of treachery. It was in the early days of March, when the grey mantle of winter had begun to lift and London wore that half-awakened air peculiar to the season, that I found myself once more in Baker Street. The pavements, still damp from a recent shower, reflected the weak gleam of the sun as it struggled through a veil of cloud. In the squares, I noted the first tentative buds upon the trees, and the hansoms rattled along with a briskness that betrayed the city's readiness for its yearly renewal. My old friend, however, appeared as indifferent to the change as to the weather itself. To Sherlock Holmes, the rhythm of nature was of less consequence than the subtle motions of the human soul. Yet I, who delighted in the small evidences of life's continuity, could not help but remark upon them as I took my seat opposite him. He sat silent, his eyes half closed, his long fingers steepled together, the very picture of abstraction. Little did I suspect that, beneath that languid exterior, his mind was already occupied with the shadow of an unusual figure soon to claim our attention. "You have doubtless observed, Watson," Holmes began presently, "that London society has of late grown enamoured of a certain foreign guest." His tone was casual, but the glint in his grey eyes betrayed deeper interest. I confessed that I had paid little heed, beyond some stray mention in the papers. "Ah, then I must enlighten you. Herr Karl von Reichen, lately arrived from Vienna, is making himself most conspicuous in the drawing rooms of Mayfair. His musical accomplishments, his courtly address, and his supposed connections with the highest personages of the Austrian capital have rendered him a figure of both admiration and of whispered caution." He drew a long breath of the familiar smoke that curled from his pipe. "Society, my dear fellow, is a poor judge of character. Its instincts are correct only in their unease. When rumour and applause travel side by side, the thoughtful man does well to take notice." With that, he relapsed into silence, while I could not but wonder what link this distinguished visitor might have to the restless energy now stirring in Holmes's manner. My first sight of the man was at a musicale given in one of the great houses off Grosvenor Square. I accompanied Holmes reluctantly, for such gatherings held little appeal for me, but he declared it essential. Von Reichen was easily distinguished among the assembly. Tall, with finely chiselled features and a manner that seemed at once gracious and commanding. His speech, though delicately accented, bore a polish that charmed his listeners, while his hands, pale and expressive, moved with the ease of one accustomed to attention. I could not deny the fascination he exerted. Even the most reserved matrons leaned forward as he spoke, and the younger ladies bestowed upon him glances of scarcely veiled admiration. Holmes, however, viewed the scene with that cool detachment I had come to know so well. He observed the stranger from a shadowed corner, taking note not only of his bearing, but of the manner in which others reacted to him. "A practised performer," he whispered to me at one point. "Observe, Watson. The calculated pause before a smile, the studied inclination of the head. Such arts are not native, but acquired. One must inquire for what purpose they are employed." And thus was my curiosity sharpened against my will. In the days that followed, I discovered that von Reichen's name was spoken in many circles, often with admiration, yet seldom without a qualifying murmur. Some hinted that his fortune was greater in appearance than in fact. Others suggested his intimacy with certain political exiles was of a questionable nature. In one club, I overheard the remark that he seemed too well informed upon matters beyond the concern of an idle traveller. Another source, more cautious, implied that his correspondence was conducted with an urgency ill-befitting mere social engagements. I relayed these tidings to Holmes, who listened with a faint smile. "It is ever thus," said he. "Where smoke is visible, one may suspect fire, though not always of the sort imagined by idle tongues. Yet I confess, Watson, that the convergence of these accounts piques my interest. The Austro-Hungarian Empire is not without its ambitions, and London society offers fertile ground for the sowing of seeds, both innocent and treacherous." His words, grave as they were, deepened the unease already growing in my mind. Back at Baker Street, Holmes subjected the man's conduct to that dispassionate scrutiny which was at once his gift and his torment. "You noted, did you not," he asked me, "the peculiar hesitation in his vowels when pressed into rapid conversation? It is the hesitation of one trained to conceal his native tongue beneath a practiced facade. Further, his right cuff bore a faint stain of ink, yet his manner suggested no habitual employment of the pen. What conclusion do you draw?" I admitted my perplexity. "Precisely," said Holmes with satisfaction. "The smallest facts are often the most eloquent. A man who writes but little, yet bears the mark of constant writing, is not what he pretends to be. Von Reichen carries himself as a dilettante, yet his hands betray the labour of documents. Combined with his cultivated charm and ambiguous connections, we have here the makings of a case most curious." He leaned back, his eyes alight with that cold flame I knew so well. "Mark my words, Watson. This visitor will not remain a figure of idle gossip. Before long, his presence shall press upon us more directly, and it will be our task to determine what lies beneath the mask. It was on a raw and cheerless morning, the sort when London's air seems weighted with a peculiar dampness, that we received an unexpected visitor at Baker Street. I had just drawn my chair nearer to the fire when Mrs. Hudson ushered into our sitting room a lady of distinguished bearing, whose pale countenance and rapid, uneven breathing betrayed a state of high agitation. Her dark attire, relieved only by a modest jet brooch, proclaimed her recent bereavement. She paused upon the threshold, as though gathering her strength, and then advanced with a dignity not wholly obscured by her evident distress. "You are Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" she asked, her voice low but resolute. My friend inclined his head gravely, offering her a seat by the hearth. I could not but note how her gloved hands tightened upon her reticule, as though she feared to let it slip. It was clear to me, even before she began her tale, that this lady carried within her not only grief, but some burden of anxiety that weighed upon her more heavily still. She gave her name as Lady Eleanor Ashcroft, widow of the late Sir Reginald Ashcroft, who had held a modest yet honourable position in the service of the Crown. Her words came haltingly, with pauses that suggested both reluctance and caution. I fear that a number of my husband's private letters have disappeared," she said at last, lowering her eyes. "They were of an intimate nature, of no possible interest beyond myself, yet I dread lest they should fall into unworthy hands." Holmes, who had remained motionless, permitted her to continue without interruption. She explained that the packet had been kept in a small escritoire within her private chamber, and that only within the last week had she discovered the absence. She insisted, however, that the contents were purely of a domestic nature, affectionate trifles not fit for public gaze, but harmless in substance. Still, there was a shadow upon her face as she spoke, and her phrases bore the air of one repeating what has been carefully rehearsed, rather than what springs naturally from truth. I felt instinctively that behind this tale of stolen letters there lurked some darker reality. Holmes now stirred, his keen gaze fixed upon her with an intensity that seemed at once courteous and merciless. "You are quite certain, Lady Eleanor," said he, "that none but yourself and your late husband knew of these papers?" She faltered a moment, then replied that to her knowledge none did. "And the escritoire, was it forced?" She shook her head. "Merely unlocked, I presume." "Yes," she admitted softly. Holmes allowed the silence to lengthen before pressing on. "You describe them as affectionate trifles, yet you are much disturbed at their loss. May I ask, Lady Eleanor, why such documents, though sentimental, should occasion in you a degree of alarm disproportionate to their character. At this, she grew visibly discomposed, her words tumbling forth in vague protestations that failed to satisfy even my less critical ear. I could see that Holmes, without raising his voice or making accusation, had already touched the weak joints of her armour, and that each question he asked drew forth a new contradiction or evasion. Throughout this exchange, I observed the lady with the practised eye of a medical man. Her hand, gloved in black kid, trembled so violently at times that she was forced to clasp it with the other in an effort at concealment. When Holmes pressed her upon the precise dates of the disappearance, she made a slip, first asserting it had been but a week, and later speaking as though several weeks had elapsed. Again, when he inquired as to whether the missing letters bore addresses or names, she replied with a hasty negative, only to add a moment later that she could not recollect with certainty. Each of these small contradictions she seemed to recognize in the instant, for she would start slightly, her lips pressing together as though to stifle some further utterance. Her agitation was not that of one mourning a trifling indiscretion, but of a woman whose secret, once exposed, would strike at her very position in society. I could not help but feel a pang of sympathy, even while acknowledging the suspicion her behaviour aroused. When at last Lady Eleanor took her leave, with many expressions of gratitude for Holmes's promised assistance, the silence of our sitting-room seemed heavy after the storm of her presence. Holmes remained for a time gazing into the fire, his long fingers drumming upon the arm of his chair. At length he spoke, more to himself than to me. "Personal letters, Watson? No. I have little doubt that the documents in question are of far greater import than her words suggest. She dreads their discovery not for what they reveal of her heart, but for what they disclose of her husband's dealings. We stand, I fancy, not at the threshold of a scandal, but upon the brink of a question of state." He leaned back, and his eyes shone with the cold light that always accompanied the scent of an intriguing pursuit. The widow with trembling hands has told us but half her story. It is for us to uncover the rest. It was upon the strength of an engraved card, delivered by hand and bearing the crest of an old and reputable family, that Holmes and I found ourselves bound for Mayfair on a particularly brisk evening. I confess that I had raised some objection to attending, for my practice at that time was pressing, and such assemblies seldom held attraction for me. Yet Holmes insisted, with that quiet authority I had long since learned not to contest, that the gathering would afford us an opportunity not merely of social diversion, but of professional significance. "There are threads," said he, as our cab rattled through the lamplit streets, "which must be observed in their natural tangle before one may hope to unravel them. Tonight will present one such skein." I pressed him further, but he offered only the half-smile which signified that his thoughts were occupied with matters he did not yet intend to reveal. Thus it was that I, somewhat reluctantly, entered the gilded drawing-rooms of Mayfair, whose opulent light and chatter stood in strange contrast to the gloom of Baker Street. We had not been long amidst the throng before our hostess, a gracious woman of advanced years and considerable vivacity, directed us towards a gentleman whose presence had already drawn much attention. Herr Karl von Reichen, lately arrived from Vienna, was tall and composed, his hair swept back with meticulous care, his countenance pale yet animated. He greeted us with a bow of studied elegance and spoke in English so fluent that only the faintest trace of accent betrayed his foreign birth. The warmth of his manner, his readiness of speech, and the charm with which he alluded to music, literature and travel made him instantly agreeable to the company. Even the most critical eye could scarcely fail to admire the ease with which he moved among strangers, adopting the tone most likely to win their favour. I, who am no adept in such arts, could not but acknowledge the grace of his bearing, though something in his glances, too swift, too measuring, gave me pause. Holmes, I observed, received the introduction with cool courtesy, his gaze intent yet inscrutable. As the evening progressed, I became increasingly aware of the influence this foreign gentleman exerted upon the company. Ladies leaned forward to catch his words, while gentlemen, no less susceptible, sought his opinion on matters of diplomacy and art. Laughter followed him. Admiration attended him, and wherever he turned, the conversation seemed to rise a degree in animation. It was as though he carried with him a light, which shone upon those nearest to him. For myself, I could not help but feel that the impression he created, though dazzling, was somewhat theatrical, as though every gesture had been rehearsed upon some invisible stage. I turned to Holmes, but found him aloof, his eyes fixed with a curious steadiness upon the man. There was no admiration in his glance, nor yet hostility, rather the calm regard of one who dissects, layer by layer, the construction of a mask. When I remarked upon the general delight Herr von Reichen inspired, Holmes merely murmured, "Charm, Watson, is often the most effective of disguises." It was during the interval, when music and conversation momentarily subsided, that Holmes drew my attention to certain peculiarities. "Observe, Watson," he whispered, as von Reichen conversed with a pair of gentlemen near the mantel. "His accent. It shifts ever so slightly when he grows animated. At one moment, the cadence is Viennese, at another more akin to the speech of southern Germany. No man of genuine upbringing permits such betrayal. Note also the right hand, how he restrains its movement by holding his gloves. It is the hand of a man habituated to writing quickly, yet he would pass himself as one whose life is devoted to leisure. These are inconsistencies which no practiced smile can wholly conceal." I watched more intently thereafter, and indeed thought I discerned the slight hesitation in his vowels and the rigid control in his gestures which Holmes had indicated. Yet I, less trained in observation, might easily have dismissed such details had not Holmes pointed them out. That they had escaped the notice of others present was no surprise to me. The evening drew at last to its close, the guests dispersing with the customary effusion of thanks and compliments. As our cab bore us away from the glittering facade, I ventured to speak of the impression the gentleman had produced. "He is brilliant, assuredly," I said, "and whatever his peculiarities, one can scarce deny his fascination." Holmes gave a short, dry laugh. "Brilliance, Watson, may dazzle the eye while blinding the judgment. I have seldom encountered a man whose surface so carefully concealed an undercurrent of duplicity. Beneath his polish lies something at variance with his pretensions, though the precise nature of that variance remains yet to be determined. This von Reichen is no mere traveller come to entertain London drawing-rooms. There is a shadow upon him, faint but discernible, and it will bear closer inquiry." With that, Holmes relapsed into silence, his keen profile outlined against the dark interior of the cab, and I knew that the figure of the foreign gentleman would henceforth occupy his restless mind. It was a little past midnight when a hurried knocking at our door roused Holmes and myself from a quiet evening of study. Mrs. Hudson, pale with alarm, announced the arrival of a footman in Lady Eleanor Ashcroft's livery. The fellow, breathless with haste, delivered a message imploring Holmes's immediate attendance at her residence in Belgravia. Without hesitation, my companion seized his coat and hat, and I, scarcely less eager, followed close upon his heels. The air outside was sharp, the gas lamps casting long shadows upon the wet pavement as we hastened to secure a cab. During the short drive, Holmes sat silent, his eyes gleaming with a restless energy that betrayed his anticipation. "It will not be a mere theft of trinkets," he said at last. Lady Eleanor's apprehensions were of too grave a kind. "Tonight, Watson, we may touch the very heart of her hidden secret." The carriage drew up before a handsome residence, where anxious servants clustered about the door. Their mistress, pale and drawn, awaited us in the hall, declaring in broken tones that her chamber had been entered, though the intruder had long since fled. We were ushered into a spacious drawing-room, whose once orderly appearance now bore witness to rude invasion. The doors of several cabinets stood flung open, their contents disarranged, while drawers had been wrenched from their fittings and lay upon the floor like dismembered limbs. Yet upon a hasty inspection, it became clear that nothing of obvious value had been removed. The silver ornaments remained in place, the pictures undisturbed, and the richly bound volumes still lined the shelves. I remarked upon this peculiarity, but Holmes only nodded with that inscrutable air, which told me he had already marked more than I could perceive. Lady Eleanor, clasping her shawl about her shoulders, declared that no jewels were missing, nor any article of household worth. Her agitation, however, was such that her words were scarcely coherent, and it was evident that the outrage had struck at something far deeper than mere property. Holmes dismissed the servants and began his examination with the calm deliberation of a surgeon preparing for an operation, his every glance and gesture charged with purpose. He moved slowly about the room, his keen eyes fixed upon the carpet, where the thick pile of turkey weave bore faint yet discernible traces. "See here, Watson," he whispered, stooping low. "The nap is pressed in one direction." Our intruder crossed quickly from the window towards the escritoire and returned by the same path. He pointed also to a chair, drawn slightly askew, its polish marred by the pressure of a damp sleeve. Near the window, the sill bore the faint imprint of a shoe sole, blurred by the night's moisture, but distinct enough for Holmes to pronounce it the mark of a man of middle height, wearing foreign-made boots. By piecing together these subtle indications, he reconstructed the intruder's progress through the chamber, with the precision of one who reads a printed page. "He entered with a key or other device," said Holmes, "for there is no mark of forced entry. He moved directly to the desk, sought a particular object, and having secured or attempted to secure it, departed in haste." His voice was low, yet it carried a weight of certainty that made Lady Eleanor clasp her hands more tightly still. It was while examining the recess behind the writing desk that Holmes uttered a soft exclamation of satisfaction. From the narrow crevice between the desk and the wall, he drew forth a scrap of paper, charred along its edges, as though it had been thrust hastily into the fire and then rescued half consumed. The fragment bore strange symbols and figures, written in a cramped hand, their meaning utterly obscure to me. "What do you make of it, Watson?" Holmes asked, holding it beneath the lamplight. I confessed my ignorance, for the markings were wholly unlike any system of shorthand or notation with which I was familiar. Holmes, however, examined it with an intensity that betrayed its significance. "The attempt to destroy this paper," said he, "is in itself eloquent. Its concealment here, rather than in the grate, suggests interruption or panic. Our visitor did not succeed in his purpose, and this fragment, trifling as it appears, may prove of the first importance." Lady Eleanor's eyes fixed upon it with something akin to dread, though she made no comment, and Holmes slipped it quietly into his pocketbook. When at last the room had been restored to order, and Lady Eleanor persuaded to retire, Holmes and I withdrew, leaving the household to its uneasy rest. As we walked together through the silent streets towards Baker Street, he turned the matter over in his mind with that peculiar blend of detachment and suppressed eagerness I had seen on many a former case. "You perceive, Watson," said he, "that this is no affair of domestic correspondence. The symbols are not the devices of a lover's fancy, but the characters of a cipher, and their alignment suggests to me no less than a schedule or plan of movement. Naval, perhaps, but certainly of strategic value. It is no common burglar who hazards so daring an intrusion, rather an agent who seeks intelligence, and whose failure tonight leaves the game still in play. Lady Eleanor's tale of stolen love letters is but the curtain to a drama of deeper significance. We stand now, I believe, upon the threshold of a question that touches the very security of the realm." His words lingered in my thoughts, casting a long shadow as we made our way homeward through the sleeping city. It was scarcely mid-morning when a loud rap sounded upon our sitting-room door, and before Mrs. Hudson could properly announce him, a tall, spare figure entered with the air of a man too preoccupied to observe decorum. His coat was unbuttoned, his boots still dusted with the grime of hurried travel, and his features bore that strained look of one who carries within him a burden not easily laid aside. "Major Henry Ashcroft," he declared, inclining his head with stiff formality. His voice, though firm, lacked steadiness, and his restless movements betrayed an inner conflict that no military bearing could wholly suppress. Holmes, who had risen with his usual languid courtesy, regarded him with that piercing glance which seemed to strip pretense from any man. For my part, I was struck at once by the haunted expression in the Major's eyes, the look of one who both dreads and desires to speak. He seated himself heavily, and for some moments could only draw his gloves through his hands, as though he sought to master himself before embarking on the matter that had driven him so unceremoniously to Baker Street. At length he spoke, though with hesitation, as though each word had to be wrestled into utterance. "Mr. Holmes," said he, "I come to you not on my own account, but out of duty to my brother's widow. Lady Eleanor has suffered enough, and it grieves me to think that her grief is now compounded by the attentions of a foreign adventurer. I refer to this Herr von Reichen." The name was spoken with evident distaste. "He has insinuated himself into her confidence, gained her ear, and, I fear, exerts an influence most pernicious. I cannot say by what arts, but I am convinced that his purpose is not honourable. I have seen them together, too often, too long, and the impression is unmistakable." His words tumbled out in jerks, his tone by turns indignant and apologetic, as though he wished to condemn, yet feared to overstate. He insisted that his concern was solely to shield Lady Eleanor from harm, that he sought no advantage for himself, but that as her late husband's brother, he could not stand idle while she fell prey to a schemer. Holmes, who had listened with impassive face, now leaned forward, his thin hands folded upon his knee. "You have observed Herr von Reichen closely, then. You can tell me at what times and in what manner he frequents Lady Eleanor's residence." The Major hesitated, then offered particulars, yet they were confused and at variance with what we ourselves had witnessed. "And you are certain," pressed Holmes, "that her manner towards him denotes an undue intimacy?" The Major coloured slightly and muttered that it did. "Curious," Holmes murmured, "for on one occasion at least I observed a distinct reserve on her part. You will forgive me if I say your statements do not wholly accord with fact." The Major started, protested, and sought to amend his words, but in so doing only involved himself in fresh contradictions. Where one moment he asserted he had witnessed a clandestine meeting, the next he admitted it might have been a mere chance encounter. Holmes's questions, precise and unrelenting, drew forth inconsistency after inconsistency, until the Major's account appeared riddled with holes. As this curious interview proceeded, I found my attention drawn less to the Major's words than to his manner. His fingers twitched continually upon the head of his cane, and more than once the ivory knob slipped in his damp palm. His gaze wandered from the carpet to the window, seldom resting upon Holmes, and when pressed too closely, he would lick his lips and swallow, as though his throat were parched. These were not, to my medical eye, the symptoms of honest indignation, but rather of inward apprehension. It was as though he feared not only for Lady Eleanor's honour, but for himself, though of what I could not yet discern. I could not help but pity the man, for the tremor in his hand betrayed an agitation beyond his control. Yet pity was mingled with mistrust, for his every gesture suggested that he concealed more than he disclosed. If his object had been to inspire confidence in his zeal, he had failed signally with me. At last he rose, declaring that he had discharged his duty and could do no more. With stiff bows, he took his leave, though the strain in his voice and the haste of his retreat gave the lie to his affected composure. When the door had closed behind him, Holmes remained silent for a space, his gaze fixed thoughtfully upon the place where the Major had sat. "An odd visitor, Watson," said he at length. "He came intending to cast suspicion upon von Reichen, yet succeeded chiefly in fastening it upon himself. A man may speak falsely by excess as well as by defect. His eagerness to paint the foreigner in blackest colours was overdone, and the contradictions in his account betray more than mere confusion. Whether he acts from jealousy, fear, or some deeper motive, I cannot yet determine. But of this I am certain. The brother of Sir Reginald Ashcroft is himself a piece upon the board, and not a mere spectator. The calm certainty of Holmes's words sent a chill through me, for I felt that the shadows gathering about Lady Eleanor's household had grown deeper with the Major's visit. Back once more in our familiar quarters at Baker Street, Holmes drew from his pocketbook the charred fragment he had secured from Lady Eleanor's residence. He spread it carefully upon the table beneath the lamplight, weighing down the curling edges with the salt cellar and the case of his lens. The faint strokes of ink stood stark against the scorched paper, a strange series of numerals interspersed with cryptic marks resembling triangles, crosses, and small arrows. I leaned forward, baffled, for to my untrained eye it suggested nothing beyond the idle doodlings of a man with a restless hand. Holmes, however, had assumed that expression of keen absorption which I had long since learned to associate with discovery. His brow furrowed, his lips pressed thin, and his long forefinger traced lightly along the characters as though to feel their meaning. "A cipher, Watson," he murmured at last, "conceived not by a schoolboy, nor by an amateur of puzzles, but by a practised intelligence. Observe the systematic spacing. It is not accident but design." I said nothing, content to watch the workings of his extraordinary mind. Holmes now took from the shelves several slim volumes of reference, laying them open with practised ease. He compared the fragment to examples of military codes, and then, with pencil in hand, began a slow, methodical process of substitution. "Note, Watson," said he, "that the repeated symbols fall into regular intervals. They may represent days of the week, or vessels of a fleet. The numerals are not random. They correspond too neatly to be meaningless. It is often by seeking the fixed points, the constants, that one may penetrate the disguise." He scribbled upon a sheet of paper, crossing out, rewriting, and muttering quietly to himself. I marvelled at his patience, for though the task seemed tedious to me, he approached it with the calm precision of a craftsman. Step by step the characters yielded, until a faint outline of coherence began to emerge. His deductions were not leaps of inspiration, but rather the careful piecing together of fragments until a pattern stood revealed, much as a painter builds his canvas stroke by stroke. At last, after some minutes of unbroken concentration, Holmes pushed aside his notes and leaned back in his chair. "We have it, Watson," he declared. "This is no sentimental effusion, but a schedule, a list of times and locations. See here, Portsmouth, Plymouth, Dover, each marked by a sequence of figures denoting hours and dates. And here, these symbols of anchor and pennant, surely naval in character. What does this signify, if not the planned manoeuvres of His Majesty's fleet?" I bent eagerly over the paper, and though the details were obscure to me, I could not mistake the grave import of what he said. To think that the safety of the realm might hinge upon so slight a remnant as this half-burnt scrap of paper sent a chill through me. "Then Lady Eleanor's talk of stolen love letters," I began. Holmes cut me short with a grim smile. "A veil, Watson, and a thin one at that." The discovery cast my thoughts back to the figure of von Reichen, whose foreign elegance had so impressed the society of Mayfair. I recalled the ease of his manner, the studied charm, the faint slip of accent which Holmes had noted. To me it seemed impossible that such a man should be unconnected with this sinister fragment. Holmes, however, regarded the matter with greater caution. "Von Reichen," said he, "is a man of Vienna, and Vienna stands at the heart of an empire whose diplomacy is often entwined with secrecy. Such intelligence as this," he tapped the paper, "would be of the highest value to their naval attachés. That does not prove, however, that our foreigner is the thief. He may be but a messenger, or indeed an innocent cover for another's machinations. Still, his presence in London at this precise juncture is a coincidence I cannot overlook." He spoke without heat, but with that cool precision which made his words more weighty than any show of passion. My own mind, less disciplined, leapt readily to conclusions. "Surely," I exclaimed. "This must settle the matter. The cipher points to naval secrets. Von Reichen is from Vienna, and Lady Eleanor is in evident fear. Can we doubt that he is the guilty party?" Holmes regarded me with his accustomed half-smile. "Ah, Watson, your heart is ever generous, but your logic occasionally hasty. To seize upon the most obvious suspect is the common failing of police and public alike. Remember, the true criminal often hides behind the mask of probability, letting suspicion fall upon another. Until we have proof, irrefutable, inexorable, we must not allow ourselves to be led astray by appearances. Trust me, the case is not so simple as it seems." He folded the fragment, placed it once more within his pocketbook, and drew upon his pipe. The thin blue smoke curled upwards as he sat in thought, while I pondered his words with a mixture of impatience and admiration. It was Holmes who first proposed that we spend the following evening at Covent Garden. Though my tastes inclined to music, I was surprised by his sudden enthusiasm, for he was not ordinarily a patron of the opera. "My dear Watson," said he, as we walked together after dinner, "the opera house is not merely a temple of art, it is a crossroads of society, a stage not only for singers, but for the intrigues of statesmen, adventurers, and those who profit by shadow rather than light. Tonight, it will serve us as both diversion and experiment. The man we pursue will not resist so public an occasion, for the brilliance of society offers the most convenient cover for secrecy." He spoke with quiet conviction, and though I pressed him for more, he only smiled and said, "Patience. The drama we are to witness will unfold with the music." With that enigmatic assurance, we found ourselves in evening dress, seated in a box overlooking the glittering expanse of the opera house, my curiosity thoroughly aroused. The spectacle that greeted us was one of such splendour as only London can command. The house glittered with jewels and silk, and the hum of expectation mingled with the tuning of the orchestra. The great chandelier cast its light upon a sea of faces, many familiar to me from the illustrated papers, for half of fashionable London seemed gathered there. Yet, while I allowed myself a moment's appreciation of the scene, Holmes's gaze never strayed to the stage or to the gilt ceiling above it. His keen eyes were fixed with unrelenting steadiness upon a figure in one of the grand tiers opposite us. "Observe, Watson," he whispered. "Our Viennese friend affects indifference to the spectacle, yet his every glance is furtive. He scans the crowd not as a lover of music, but as a conspirator in search of his contact. Watch his hands, his movements during the intervals. That is when the true performance will occur." I followed Holmes's direction, and saw indeed that von Reichen, though conversing easily with his companions, allowed his attention to wander ever towards the side entrances and the passages between the boxes. It was during the first interval that Holmes's prediction was verified. Von Reichen, under cover of the crowd pressing towards the refreshment rooms, slipped quietly from his seat. Holmes, without rising, indicated with a nod of his chin that we should remain watchful. From our vantage, we observed him pass into the corridor, where the glitter of jewels gave way to the sombre cloaks of those moving in secrecy. There, in the shadow of a marble column, he drew from his breast a sealed envelope, which he placed with swift precision into the hand of a figure muffled in a dark cloak. The exchange was as brief as the passing of a coin at a toll gate. Yet to our eyes, sharpened by expectation, it was eloquent. "There, Watson," Holmes murmured, "the opera within the opera." My heart quickened as I grasped the significance of what we had seen. Without a word, Holmes rose and moved with quiet swiftness, threading his way through the throng. I followed close upon his heels as he kept the cloaked figure in sight. The person moved with evident haste, seeking the outer passages, but Holmes's long stride soon brought us within arm's length. With a firm hand, he caught the figure by the sleeve. "Madam," said he softly, "your cloak conceals more than modesty. Be so good as to remove it." The figure recoiled, but under his steady gaze the hood was drawn back, and I started in astonishment. It was Lady Eleanor Ashcroft who stood before us, her eyes wide with fear, and her lips parted as if to protest, though no sound came. She looked from Holmes to me, her face pale beneath the lamplight. And in that moment I understood that the mystery of her evasions had reached its crisis. Holmes, with the gentleness that often surprised me in him, released her arm and inclined his head. "Lady Eleanor," he said, "you have spared us the trouble of further conjecture. The packet you carry is not the mere trifle you would have us believe. It is, I think, the very heart of this affair." She seemed about to faint, but steadied herself with an effort. Holmes turned to me as the strains of music resumed within the house. "You see, Watson, the masquerade of stolen letters was but the prelude. We now perceive that the widow herself is an actor upon the stage, not a passive victim. The question that remains is, what role does she play? Is she pawn or partner in this intrigue?" His words, spoken in a low tone, carried the weight of revelation, and I felt as though the glittering splendor of the opera concealed a darker drama unfolding in its very midst. Holmes wasted no time in securing a private interview with Lady Eleanor, following our encounter at Covent Garden. She received us in the sombre drawing-room of her Belgravia home, her face pale but composed, as though she had resolved upon some course of action that pride alone sustained. Holmes, however, was merciless in his quiet precision. He placed himself opposite her, his figure erect, his eyes fixed with that cold penetration which no falsehood could withstand. "Lady Eleanor," said he, "you have played your part with courage, but the curtain has now fallen. You stand before us, not as the victim of theft, but as the agent of a design whose scope you scarcely comprehend." Her lips tightened, and for a moment she held his gaze with defiance, but I saw her gloved hand tremble upon the arm of her chair. She attempted to speak calmly, yet her voice faltered, and I perceived that the composure she strove to maintain was but a fragile mask that Holmes's words had already begun to shatter. When she spoke, it was with a tone in which bitterness and sorrow were strangely intermingled. "If I have erred," she said, "I have erred from loyalty to the memory of my husband. You speak of design and conspiracy. You know not what it is to see a man you revere brought low, his name at the mercy of slanderers. Sir Reginald was not the traitor men would have made him. His weakness lay not in malice, but in ambition. He was drawn into correspondence that promised him advancement, and before he realized the snare, he was ensnared beyond escape." Her eyes filled, though no tear fell, as she continued in that low, vibrating voice. "When he died, I alone was left to shield his honor. What would you have had me do, Mr. Holmes? Should I have cast his memory to the wolves, and with it the peace of my own house?" The words struck me with their pathos, and I confess that, despite the dark import of her confession, I felt my sympathy strongly stirred. Holmes, however, remained unmoved, his gaze fixed upon her as though each syllable were a step leading her further into self-betrayal. She rose suddenly, as though driven by the intensity of her own defense. "Yes, there were documents," she said hurriedly. "Yes, they bore the marks of dealings best forgotten. But they exist no longer. I destroyed them with my own hands. In the grate where you now sit, Dr. Watson, I watched them curl and blacken until not a trace remained. It was the only course left to me, the only way to spare the family name further ruin. What I did not for gain, but for honor. I am a woman alone, with none to defend me but myself. Surely you can see that I could not allow those shameful relics to fall into the hands of enemies." Her hands clasped together tightly, her breath coming quick, as she uttered this appeal with a sincerity that might have persuaded any man less implacable than Holmes. For myself, I confess I almost believed her. But Holmes's eyes had narrowed, and his long fingers tapped upon the table in the manner that heralded some decisive stroke. "Destroyed," he repeated softly. "That is a curious word, Lady Eleanor, for one who leaves behind such imperfect evidence of destruction. Pray consider these." From his pocket he drew a small envelope, and laid upon the table several minute fragments of paper, charred along their edges yet still bearing traces of ink. "This, madam, I took from behind your writing desk, and here," he lifted a sheet upon which he had penciled his observations, "the faint impression of characters left upon a blotting pad. Add to these the telltale ink upon your glove, and you will perceive that your story of total annihilation does not quite withstand scrutiny." She started visibly, her colour fading, and for an instant her defiance wavered. Holmes pressed his advantage with quiet firmness. "You would persuade us that your object was concealment. In truth, it was preservation. You have not destroyed those papers, Lady Eleanor. You have guarded them, and you have sought to dispose of them under the guise of harmless correspondence. The motive was not solely loyalty to a dead man's memory, but fear and desperation." His words fell like strokes of a hammer upon her faltering resolve. At this, her strength gave way. She sank into her chair, her head bowed, her voice broken at last. "Yes," she whispered, "I kept them. I could not destroy them, for they were his last writings. I told myself they might serve as my safeguard, even my means of bargaining if necessity pressed too cruelly. I thought to pass them off as private letters, to hide their true character from those who would pay for secrets. I meant no betrayal, but only to save myself from ruin." Her confession came with a sob that she strove in vain to suppress. For the first time, I saw her proud reserve utterly broken, and I felt more pity than condemnation. Holmes, however, regarded her with grave composure. "Lady Eleanor," said he, "your heart may plead extenuation, but the law knows little of such distinction. You have trafficked in perilous matters. Yet perhaps, if the truth be rightly handled, your husband's name may still be spared, and your own burden lightened." He rose, signalling that the interview was at an end, and as we withdrew, I carried with me the image of a woman whose pride had been stripped away, leaving only a soul laid bare by fear and remorse. Holmes acted swiftly in the matter of the recovered documents. With a discretion that astonished me, he contrived to place them in the hands of the Admiralty, without the faintest whisper of Lady Eleanor's name reaching the ears of the authorities. A junior clerk of unblemished integrity was made the unwitting intermediary, Holmes employing such subtle contrivances that the papers passed into official custody as though by accident. When I remarked upon the ingenuity of his device, he smiled faintly. "The preservation of truth, Watson, need not always involve the exposure of individuals. Our task is to safeguard the state. The question of personal scandal is secondary, and in this instance, best avoided." Thus it was that the gravest peril was averted, and the intelligence which might have jeopardized the security of our fleet was secured without the ruin of the Ashcroft name. I marvelled once more at Holmes's ability to tread that narrow path between justice and compassion. The fate of Herr von Reichen was less merciful. Once suspicion was directed upon him, and his movements subjected to quiet surveillance, his influence in society evaporated with startling rapidity. Those who had a week earlier applauded his wit now averted their eyes, and the door of every drawing-room was closed against him. Within a fortnight, the Foreign Office, acting upon information discreetly supplied, demanded his departure. No protest availed him. He was escorted aboard the morning steamer with little ceremony, and England was rid of a guest whose polished exterior had concealed such perilous intent. The swiftness of his downfall impressed me deeply. "So fragile is the edifice of reputation, Watson," Holmes observed. "A single flaw, once exposed, topples the structure, however fair it may appear." For all his charm, von Reichen had vanished from London society as completely as though he had never been. Lady Eleanor, meanwhile, withdrew into seclusion. The scandal which might have destroyed her never materialized, thanks to Holmes's skill and restraint. Yet she bore upon her countenance the indelible stamp of remorse. When we called upon her some weeks later, she received us with courtesy, but the light had gone from her eyes and her voice was subdued. She spoke little of the past and nothing of the future, save to say that she intended to retire to her estate in the country. "Society will not miss me," she said quietly, and I felt in her tone the deep weariness of one who has lived too long with fear. Holmes, though unfailingly polite, did not linger, and as we took our leave, he remarked to me that the burden of memory is sometimes punishment enough. I could not but agree, for never had I seen pride so thoroughly humbled, nor the trappings of comfort so powerless to relieve inward torment. As we drove away from her house, I found my mind troubled. "Holmes," said I, "do you consider that we acted rightly? The law was never invoked, her name never spoken in connection with these papers. Is it justice to spare her exposure, or have we, by our silence, become accomplices in a species of deceit?" My question was sincere, for though I admired Holmes's resolution, I could not rid myself of a vague unease. Might not the suppression of truth in one case encourage its repetition in another? Was it not the duty of all men to speak plainly when treason was concerned? Holmes listened without interruption, his face grave, his long fingers interlaced upon his knee. It was some moments before he replied, and I knew that my words had struck home. At last he spoke, his voice calm but weighted with reflection. "You touch, Watson, upon the eternal conflict between justice and mercy. Crimes born of fear, of loyalty, of misplaced devotion, these are no less destructive than those inspired by avarice. Yet the law, in its rigidity, makes little distinction. Lady Eleanor acted not from greed, but from terror, and a desperate desire to protect a name already stained. Her punishment lies in that terror, which will haunt her as surely as any prison. Remember, it is not only the thief who steals for gain who endangers society, but also the patriot who, in shielding a secret, imperils the state. Fear and loyalty may ruin as thoroughly as avarice. If I erred, it was in choosing silence where law might have demanded speech. But sometimes, Watson, silence is the harsher sentence." He fell silent then, and I, pondering his words, felt once more the sombre weight of those cases in which human frailty and national peril are woven so inextricably together. Holmes leaned back in his chair, the glow of the fire outlining his sharp features as he drew upon his pipe. "You see, Watson," said he, "it is not always avarice that drives men and women into peril, but fear. Fear to lose a reputation, fear to be unmasked, fear to stand alone. Such emotions are as dangerous as any dagger, and often far more subtle in their destruction." I sat in silence, pondering the weight of his words, until at last I asked myself, what indeed was Lady Eleanor's gravest misstep? Her attempt to preserve her husband's memory, or her choice to barter it in shadows? What do you think was the true turning point of this case? The moment of betrayal, or the moment of fear? Share your thoughts below, and if you enjoyed this tale, do subscribe for more Sherlock Holmes mysteries and share it with those who relish a puzzle as much as we do.